Okay, so my talk is a bit different than the preceding ones. I'm focusing on different ways in which the Zhuangzi text has been read. And my interest in, I guess, applying it to modern philosophical concerns is comparatively limited. And here's a brief outline of the presentation. First, I'm just going to give brief background sketches on the three commentators I'm looking at in case they're not familiar figures in English language studies of Chinese philosophy. Then I'm going to look at their attitudes towards the Zhuangzi, which play a part in shaping their various interpretations. And then the theme of the study is framed around carefree wandering, which is just a kind of a rough and ready translation of Xiao Yao Yo. And the idea is that all three commentators take that to be a central theme of the entire text and to, in one way or another, denote a way of being a flourishing human being. And this also comes to relate in interesting ways to conversations about the true controller from chapter 2 of the received text. So our first commentator is a celebrated Buddhist monk named Hanshan Deqing, and he is one of the most famous monks of the late Ming period. And he really has two works concerning Zhuangzi. The first one is Guan Lao Zhuang Yin Xiang Dun. And I translate it here in a way that will seem inaccurate to modern speakers, but they're actually two Fuzhi in this title, two false friends. So Yin Xiang in modern Chinese, of course, just means influence, but the words individually mean shadows and shadows and echoes play a large role in his metaphysics. And if you see the structure, Guan dot 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 Lun in a title, it's usually just on, right? So why am I translating it out? It also turns out that in his 17th century usage and given his Buddhist commitments, this should be translated as something like on contemplating the shadows of and echoes of Master Lao and Master Zhuang, and we'll see why shortly. And his main commentary is Zhuangzi Ni Pian Zhu, which is a more commonplace title, and it just means a commentary on the inner chapters of the Zhuangzi. And he only comments on the inner chapters because he takes it to be the core text. This became a common view during the Ming Dynasty that the 7 inner chapters were the core text. Before then, certain chapters were doubted, but not the outer and mixed chapters as a whole. Right, it's with Zhao Hong in the Ming Dynasty that becomes the common view. So he only felt the need to write on the inner chapters. The others write on the other chapters, but they tend to be quite aggressively dismissive of a lot of them. For instance, Wang Fuzhi, who we'll be looking at, says only 20% of the outer chapters are worth reading. And here's a photo of his body was actually preserved in a monastery in Guangdong, China, for nearly 300 years. But unfortunately, in the 1960s, I mean, maybe unfortunately, for better or worse, his body was destroyed in the 1960s of the last century during the Cultural Revolution. They smashed it up. So now you, for better or worse, can't go and see his preserved body if you come to Guangdong province in China. But anyway, he's a Buddhist monk, and that will come to play a role in his approach to the Zhuangzi. And it should be noted that his metaphysical commitments are a form of idealism, which is very common given certain Neo-Confucian trends and certain Buddhist trends at the time. And here's one background passage. He says, "In my youth, I studied Confucius, but did not understand Confucius. I studied Master Lao, but I did not understand Master Lao. As I grew older, I studied Buddha, but did not understand Buddha. And then I retreated into deep mountains and great marshes, practicing stillness to contemplate the mind." And here it has to be translated with a capital M. It's indicating something akin to the storehouse consciousness. Huayan Buddhism, which is influenced by Yogacara Buddhism, is making a comeback at this time. And Buddhist authorities think that or Buddhist leaders at the time, think that reality is at bottom a form of consciousness, and the reality that we perceive are just shadows and echoes of this capital M mind. And that's why the Yin Xiang is translated in a kind of odd, antiquated way, as we can see here. Right, he says, From practicing stillness, he came to realize the three realms are only mind, all phenomena are only consciousness. Once I understood the contemplation of mind-only consciousness, I realized that all forms are shadows of the mind, right? And all sounds are echoes of the mind. Therefore, all sages are those who have grasped the essence of these shadows, and all teachings are those that harmonize with these echoes. But don't panic. He's not going to be heavy-handedly imposing his metaphysics on his interpretation of the Zhuangzi. Following the Lotus Sutra, they're going to assess the Zhuangzi and the Laozi in terms of how well it serves certain soteriological ends. So the Zhuangzi is going to lead us to asking certain philosophical questions that might lead us in this direction, but that's different from saying the Zhuangzi is committed to this sort of idealism. Our next presenter is our next commentator is a very famous Neo-Confucian philosopher, Wang Fuzhi, and he has a very different metaphysics than Hanshan Deqing. He has two Zhuangzi commentaries. One is called Zhuangzi Tong, which is just a collection of essays on most of the chapters of the Zhuangzi, except for a few that he thinks are beyond the pale. They're just so obviously forgeries that they're not even worth reading by his reckoning. And the other one is Zhuangzi Jie, which just means like explanations of the Zhuangzi. And this is a more standard commentary where you get the text with interlinear glosses explaining what passages and lines mean. Wang's thought is often regarded as a form of materialism, in contrast to the idealism that we just saw, in which the basic stuff constitutive of reality is qi, energy, henceforth qi energy, and all other aspects of reality, including bi, the principles, contra to much of the Neo-Confucian orthodoxy, and mental aspects are constituted out of this self-same qi. So this can be contrasted with Hanshan's idealism that takes phenomenal reality to be shadows and echoes of the mind, capital M. For Wang, the mental is, like all else, qi energy. And again, this is typically called a form of materialism, but that's because its popularity resurged during a period where a certain Leninized form of Marxism was current in Chinese thought. So they wanted to show that certain thinkers were materialists, right? And he happened to be from Chairman Mao's hometown, so he happened to be a good materialist. But I think strictly speaking, if we're interested in the game of assigning accurate categories to these thinkers, he's actually more of a neutral monist, right? Because the qi displays both physical and mental properties. It's not just a material substance. But in any event, I'm not too concerned about these things. It's important to realize that the first two commentators I'm looking at are bona fide philosophers. They both have definite philosophical commitments, one being an idealist, another one being a materialist or perhaps a neutral monist. Our next commentator is not even a philosopher, and it's only in the most recent Sinophone scholarship that he's being treated, that his interpretation of the Zhuangzi is being interpreted for its philosophical merits. He's actually a literary critic, and his Zhuangzi text has a special title, Zhuangzi Yin, and we'll get into that shortly. And it was in two editions. The second edition was majorly revised. The first one coming out in 1663, and the second one coming out in 1688. I tentatively translated the basis of the Zhuangzi, but this is the yin in the title is actually explicitly linked by Lin with various concepts found in the Zhuangzi text, such as yin zi ran, right, complying with the self-so or nature or the course of nature, yin shi, which he takes to be a primary notion in the text, which means adapting to this, or adapting to what others take to be right at the present moment. And he also takes it to be another notion, the Zhuangzi yi, tian di, following heaven and earth. So it's a common notion in the Zhuangzi. It's important to note that he's part of this Pingdian tradition, which is something that hasn't received much attention in the English language Zhuangzi studies. But this is a tradition of literary criticism that emerges in the Song dynasty. And it continues through later commentators. In fact, I'd say he inspired what are probably two of my favorite Zhuangzi commentaries, those of Xuanying and Liu Fengbao. And it should be noted that the Ping and Pingdian notes appraisal in terms of literary appraisal. They're not just explaining the meaning of the text, but they're assessing its merits as literature and occasionally as philosophy. The Dian might seem odd, but it indicates dots and dashes, right? And there are various dots and dashes on these texts that are used to single out certain things in the text that warrant special attention. So if you see versions of text from after the Song dynasty, they often have, as you can see here, various dots and dashes kind of vomited all over the page. And these play an important role. And unfortunately, the most recent critical edition of Zhuangzi by East China Normal University Press removes these various dots and dashes. But Lin very kindly explains to us what they mean, right? They're doing a function. It's a very important part. It's a kind of experimental punctuation that literary critics engaged in for a millennium to signal special aspects in the text. He tells us that a double circle, which I've marked out on a page of the text here, so you can see what it looks like. It's a circle within a circle. It indicates key ideas or key themes, and he takes the key idea of the chapter to be Da, largeness, expansiveness, greatness. And this is something that inspired later commentators as well. A blackened circle, right? These ones indicate corresponding parts are hidden parts, right? So we can see that Buzhi and Buzhi correspond, right? Because they're both epistemological concerns, both anatomical parts of the bird, and so on and so forth. You also have closed circles, which indicate parts with skillful phrasing, right? So he thinks when he says the northern darkness is a pool in heaven, he marks that out as warranting special attention. But be careful here. This is a standard interlinear commentary. So the main text are these fat characters, right? The thin characters, where you have two side by side, are his commentary. And when there's the circle here within the commentary, it's different than when they're next to the characters. In these cases, it means that the first bit is explaining this line specifically. And what follows this dot is commenting on everything up till that point to try to make connections to show how the text coheres. And right, we see that he signals out Da here as a key concept by giving it one of these doubled circles. And he tells us right away, this brings out the concept of Da. And then he makes a more general remark. The character Da is the main thread of the entire chapter. And then we also have these fancy dots here, which indicate transitions for a new line or places where supporting details are fully explored, right? So it's a shame that recent scholarly critical editions remove these dots and dashes because they're doing important works. And this is a mark of traditional Chinese literary criticism from the Song onward. And I only mention this not to be insulting if you know this already. It's just that a lot of my students didn't know it already. And I didn't know it already. And I'm glad that Lín Yúnmíng takes the time to explain it to people like me, right, who are ignorant. Anyway, one other thing to mention is that Hanshan Deqing and Wang Fuzhi gave their commentaries rather straightforward titles, right? A commentary on the inner chapters of the Zhuangzi, general essays, or a general comprehension of the Zhuangzi. But Zhuangzi is a very special title. And you'll recall that I said his text was in 2 editions. He includes the old preface to the first edition of 1663, in which he explains the title. So we get this nice quote from the Old Fisherman chapter: drifting about like an unmoored boat, emptily and idly wandering along. When they said the lacquer grove is a magisterial servant, lacquer grove is a way they sometimes refer to Zhuangzi. It's his purported workplace, according to the records of the Grand Historian, right? And sometimes they just call him the lacquer grove. Or the lacquer grove is a wicked man, or when they shouted out A, and he considered himself an A, or when they shouted out B, and he considered himself a B, why would he have been concerned with whether they liked him or not? He was indeed only going along with them, right? He wasn't bringing in his own viewpoint, hence I use in the title. So that's quite interesting. And it's important to note A.C. Graham does cite Lín Yúnmíng, and that A.C. Graham's assessment of inshi as a technical term is almost entirely derived from Lín Yúnmíng's commentary. Anyway, so that's a general background, right? We have a very famous Buddhist monk, a very famous Neo-Confucian philosopher, and a very famous literary critic. In fact, in some early editions of Dream of the Red Chamber, it specifically mentions Lín Yúnmíng's Zhuangzi in a poem. So it at least had currency at the time. So when it comes to Hanshan Deqing, and his commentary will be the stranger of the 3, whereas I think Lín Yúnmíng will be the most commonplace of the 3. But at the beginning, and at the very opening annotation, at the end of it, he makes a request to us in his commentary on the inner chapters. He says, the origin of my scholarship is fully explained in my Yingxiang Dun, right? This text, this on contemplating the shadows and echoes of Master Lao and Master Zhuang. And I've already explained why I translate it this way instead of just on the influence of. And he requests us to consult it. So we consult it, right? Here's what he wants us to read. And I don't know that I should read the whole thing, but the upshot of this text is he wants to show it's okay for Buddhists to study the Zhuangzi, that the Zhuangzi has value not contained within the Buddhist texts. He wants to present a conception of philosophy on analogy of medicine, where philosophy is meant to cure our plight as humans, right? We're suffering and living in ineffective ways, and it wants to correct us. So at one point during his life, he lived during a seashore, and he says, someone asked me about the Zhuangzi by the sea. I sighed. Again, it could be a sigh of admiration or a sigh of regret. We don't know, right? So this is just an ambiguity in the text, saying, studying Buddhism without understanding the 100 schools of the Warring States period not only means not knowing worldly Dharma, but also means not knowing Buddha Dharma, right? You need to be well-rounded. You need to study the classic texts as well as Buddhist texts. Interpreting Zhuangzi as if it encompasses all Buddhist sutras means not only misunderstanding the Buddha's intention, but also Zhuang's. Therefore, I say, without knowing the spring and autumn annals, without knowing, one cannot govern the mundane world. Without knowing the Laozi and Zhuangzi, one cannot forget the mundane world. Wang, as forget, means something like let it be and leave it alone, right? It's not forget in terms of just forgetting about it. And without practicing Chan or Zen in Japanese, one cannot transcend the mundane world. So he's trying to have a well-rounded approach. And he goes on to make interesting comparisons to Buddhism, but the conclusion is, in my opinion, the grand statements of Master Lao and Master Zhuang cannot be fully verified without the Buddhist Dharma. If contemplated from the perspective of mind-only consciousness, the teachings are all shadows and echoes of the mind. This requires some unpacking, and there's a lot of careful Sinophone scholarship on this. But the idea is that he's not saying that we need the Zhuangzi contains Buddhist doctrines, a viewpoint explicitly maintained by Lin Qi. He doesn't think it contains Buddhist doctrines, but he thinks Buddhism's true as a Buddhist. So it's setting the truth criteria for assessing the merits of Zhuangzi. And all teachings and all phenomenal things wind up being shadows and echoes of this underlying mind. And insofar as this text leads one to this realization, it's a useful, skillful means. And it's therefore a useful teaching. And we're going to see how and why he thinks that's the case. Our next thinker, again, is Wang Fuzhi. And he explains the background in which he wrote his commentary. And this is a useful quote because it also doubles as the background for the other commentators we're working on here. They're all writing when the Manchus are destabilizing China and eventually overtake China and establish the final dynasty of imperial China, right? So in his author's note at the beginning of Zhuangzi Tong, he says, I took refuge from the chaos of war between the Ming loyalists, which he was one of, and the conquering Manchu tribes. He was in the mountains, dwelling among deers, yada, yada, yada. He sat in serene contemplation, and he reflected. He said, my heart can't express itself. People don't understand me. I've been drifting about. But here's where it gets interesting. He says, my response to this situation was somewhat like our friend Mr. Zhuang's. This is another way in which Zhuangzi is referred to in the commentaries. This is when they aren't quite ready to say Zhuang's Master Zhuang, right? So they say our friend Mr. Zhuang, this person we can have a nice conversation with and learn some things from, but who are not necessarily taking us an authority, though we eventually start calling him Zhuangzi later on. And he felt a sense of shame for studying Zhuangzi. And he goes out his way to say I wasn't a disciple of him. However, there are certain characters in the text that guided his heart. And he thinks of his heart's in pursuit of benevolence. What could possibly be wrong with that? Right. So the big idea here is he wants to say, even for someone following our friend Mr. Zhuang's philosophy, it is possible not to fully adopt his approach. As for me, interpreting our friend Mr. Zhuang's teaching aligns closely with my own approach. I am a person with a large goiter, referring to a character from the text, without proper clothing, dwelling between talent and mediocrity. And he starts to liken his situation to that in the Zhuangzi. But the idea is we just want to get a sense of his attitude towards the Zhuangzi. For Hanshan Deqing, he was obviously a Buddhist, and he wanted to use his Buddhist perspective, informed by this idea of an underlying conscious substratum of reality, to assess the value of the Zhuangzi as a means towards eventually leading to that insight, even if the text wasn't committed to it. Wang Fuzhi, in contrast, is a Ming loyalist who's running away from war, living in the mountains, and he's kind of ashamed with the fact that he's feeling sympathy with Zhuangzi, and he feels the need to justify this. Our final commentator, the literary critic, is much more amusing. I find it quite interesting. You might find it kitschy, but we will see. But he says, I have a fragmented nature, unsuitable for worldly affairs, and thus I feel a close affinity with the Zhuangzi. I loved it since my youth, and my affection has only deepened over time. As I grew older, I delved into various philosophical texts, reflecting on the transient nature of life and questioning its true meaning. I imagined myself having a carefree rest in the land of non-being, right? What Zhuangzi recommends his friend do under a tree at the end of the first chapter, with just a hat and a gourd, fulfilling my life's work. Right, so his attitude's quite different. He presents himself as kind of a Zhuangzi, intoxicated type of individual who's deeply sympathetic with it. He goes on to discuss it more. In the interest of time, we'll just do the bit I highlighted for special attention. He says, to wander the world with an open heart-mind, unharmed by others, while not completely withdrawing from society, right? That's a crucial point. It was the great Tao. Now, fortune and misfortune come to me as naturally as the sequence of wind, rain, cold, and heat, not enough to cause disturbance. This is the essence of the Zhuangzi that I have gained. Actually, I probably should just translate as that's what I gained from the Zhuangzi. Far beyond a superficial understanding. And if you see any issues with the translations, a lot of these are my attempts that I've been working on for quite some time. The previous one of Wang Fuzhi's preface, I need to give credit to Dave, who's presenting tomorrow, because the initial translation I did with him like 5 years ago. But anyway, if you see anything wrong in them, tell me, because it's better to find out now than when it's in print, which has happened to me before. We get this last nice bit of Lin's attitude towards the Zhuangzi from later in life, when he's reflecting back on his life, and he speaks in the third person, and he says, haha, who is this old fellow? He once studied diligently by the window and also viewed flowers in the imperial gardens, right? His fortunes in life were up and down. He had high stations, and he also endured periods of homelessness, like many people at the time when the Manchus were conquering China. He once administered justice in the southern commandery and also found himself homeless in the central marshes. Today, with bare head and feet, he wanders freely to the ends of the earth. I wonder how this old man manages to be so. I suspect he must have internalized the teachings of the Zhuangzi in his heart. Right, so it's quite, I think it's interesting. You might think it's just pure kitsch and sentimental, but whatever. Right, he goes on to say, in the revised edition preface, he slept and ate with the Zhuangzi, and he wrote the best commentary ever. And if people read it, they'll appreciate his labors and understand it. One thing you'll find about Lín Yúnmíng is he thinks he's always right, and that all the previous commentators were very stupid and got everything almost completely wrong. Anyway, so that's their attitudes, right? So we're looking at 3 commentators, a famed Buddhist, a famed Neo-Confucian, and a famed literary critic. Now we're going to focus specifically on the famed Buddhist conception of human flourishing in the mode of carefree wandering. And again, this will be framed around a bunch of my translation attempts, and if you see anything that can be improved upon, don't hesitate to tell me. It won't offend me. It's quite useful. Anyway, the first line here, and he's commenting on the second chapter here, actually, not the first chapter. But he says the chapter establishes forgetting the ego perspective, right? 我见 usually. But here it's just 我 as primary. If one does not cling to one's ego perspective and one's self-righteousness, one must realize their inherent true controller. and shed the false self of the physical body, and then naturally merge completely with the realm of the great Tao. This is the practice of leveling things. The things to note now is he thinks that we're all self-preoccupied, that we think we're important and that what we do matters. All right, that we think we're good people, and he thinks that that's bad, and that we actually need to see how things really hang together. The true controller, this idea comes up in the second chapter, and in his reading, there actually is a true controller, and he thinks it's our Zhenxing, our true inborn nature, understood along Buddhist lines. And here we go. He explains it when glossing the Heavenly Pipings passage, which opens chapter 2. And I'll just jump ahead to the key parts that I highlighted. He says, because each person receives a different physical form and capacity, their knowledge and views differ. It's like the sounds from the various openings in the trees, right, that are being contemplated at the beginning of the chapter, being different, hence the saying, blowing through 10,000 different openings. So he thinks that people have different constitutions, which leads to them having different perspectives on the world. He says, the phrase making them sound of themselves, that is the hollows in the passage, he says it's referring allegorically to how people become confused about the unity of this true controller, the true nature of reality, only recognizing their flesh and bodies as their true selves. Again, he thinks that our physical bodies are in some sense dreamlike or illusions, right? So we're at their extreme interpretation. And taking their partial viewpoints as correct. Thus it says, making them sound of themselves, meaning they speak from their individual selves. This is the root cause of their inability to level the discourses on things. Now we get a very strange interpretation of a line from the second chapter, right? It's usually translated as something like, all of them make their own selections, so who do we need, or who would it be that puffs these various sounding hollows into action? And the Guoxiang interpretation is that this is a rhetorical question, right? He interprets the "yi" as indicating this is a rhetorical question, and there's nothing that blows these pipes into action. But now we'll get a weird reading here by our Buddhist monk. He says the "she," the "who," asks us to observe who ultimately initiates human speech, right? I'm rambling on now about this. What's controlling this? People only know that speech comes from themselves, but they do not recognize the true controller governing it. If one does not realize this true controller, then their words are all those of the ego perspective and not words that carry the Tao. From this, our rights and wrongs, our various disputes over rights and wrongs arise, and one remains unenlightened. One must recognize the true controller. And again, this is just a tacit way of saying the way things actually are, the way they hang together. And this actually has maybe some bearing on the previous presentation, insofar as Hanshan Deqing clearly thinks when we enter disputes, we're bringing our ego to bear and our sense of self-importance, and that's why we want to chomp down our opponents in debate or something like that. It becomes a kind of tacit warfare. One other interesting bit here is he says the direct instruction to people lies in the phrase observing oneself. Who is it that stirs them into action? Right, that's not how this is usually translated, but it's how he glosses it. And he thinks this is suggesting a practice. He thinks we ask ourselves, who's controlling what I'm saying now? Who's controlling these weird gesticulations with my arms and so on and so forth? He thinks reflecting on that is itself a contemplative practice of sorts. Anyway, our last slide on this guy before we get to some maybe a bit more normal commentators. And again, he's a Buddhist, but he's not exactly trying to impose Buddhist doctrines, I insist, but you can form your own opinions. But he's going to explain the notion that concerns me. And I'll translate Xiaoyao as carefree for now, because that translation still works, but with some of the other commentators, it's not a binomial expression. It's actually two different words. But he says it's the idea of a vast freedom. And he says it's exactly like the unobstructed liberation of the Buddha Sutras. While the Buddha advocated liberation by eliminating afflictions, Zhuangzi instead advocated liberation by transcending the physical body, or pushing off the physical body and not being preoccupied with it, right? Like all those people in chapter 5 of the Zhuangzi who, if they get an arm chopped off or something, are unbothered by it. Extinguishing cleverness and craftiness, and by not letting the achievements of fame in one's lifetime become a burden of obstruction. Right, so this is just kind of reiterating what he said before. We tend to be too clever, too self-important, too scheming, and that's what the Zhuangzi, the various fables and parables of the Zhuangzi are intended to correct on his interpretation. We get a very important part of his interpretation here, and I found recently that there actually is an English dissertation written on this by a Douglas Berger student, and he focuses on this aspect of the commentary. And it's that Master Zhuang's idea is that only a veritable individual or a true individual can rove about in the state of vast freedom. It is precisely what he calls masters of the great primeval inspiration, right? The Dazong Shi of chapter 6 is none other than this person. Now, if you flip through various compiled commentary editions of the Zhuangzi, you'll find that Dazong Shi is typically glossed as the Tao. But that's not how Hanshan Deqing reads it. He actually thinks that it's the sage, and he thinks that we want to become masters of the great primeval inspiration, and that the Zhuangzi's first in the first 6 chapters teaching us how to cultivate intersageliness so that we can then learn how to transform people, right? And that's one of the undercurrents of his entire interpretation. But here we get some more practical advice. He says persons of the mundane world are unable to be carefree in this way because they are constrained by the word I. Doesn't necessarily be interpreted along the lines of Buddhist doctrines of no self. It's more that we have a sense of who we are and it becomes important to us and motivates what we do in all sorts of unproductive ways, right? And that's the point he makes here. Owing to this, everything they do, us or people of the mundane world, perhaps we're all enlightened sages on his reckoning, is for the sake of seeking personal achievement and fame. Right? So his picture of what we're like in our default modes as humans is not very sympathetic or flattering. And he says only great sages, these masters of the great primeval inspiration, who have forgotten these 3 matters, meaning achievements, fame, and oneself, can experience endless carefreedom and true joy. And he says, therefore, the true intention of this chapter is to establish the fundamental principle that perfected, this is the line that ends the famous Peng bird passage. The perfected individuals have no self, sages have no achievement, and spiritual beings have no fame. And he gives us a bit of literary criticism. He says the central idea is established first through the story of the Peng bird and only revealed later with this odd concluding remark, which is the author's technique for developing and enlivening the text. Right, so they engage in extensive literary criticism. You don't see this sort of thing in Guo Xiang's commentary or the early commentators, right? They're all very serious and very literal in their interpretations. If students can understand the original intent of the writing, the purpose of the entire book becomes clear. So that's Hanshan's account of carefree wandering. He thinks there is a true controller, and he thinks the way to understand the true controller is to get over ourselves, realize we're not important, and then we can finally learn how to be happy, and we can actually eventually learn how to sway others, given this constituted state. And that's carefree wandering in a nutshell on our first reading by our esteemed Buddhist. Next is our esteemed Neo-Confucian. And I tend to focus on weird aspects that fall out of a lot of, to my mind, fall out of a lot of the contemporary Anglophone scholarship on the Zhuangzi. But there's a lot of talk about certain kinds of things that the traditional commentators think warrant attention and that we don't talk about for whatever reason, and things like following the breath or the circulation of qi energy. And he says the circulation of qi energy depends on breath, and the subtle initiating impulses of heaven operate accordingly. When a superficial clarity or enlightenment is restrained and true or veritable understanding is restored, qi energy becomes tranquil and inward focused, permeating the entire body. The subtle initiating impulses of heaven ascend and descend with the breath. The deeper the breath, the deeper the subtle initiating impulses of heaven. And this is, of course, referring to chapter 6 when it talks about the veritable individuals breathing from their heels. These are the types of lines that maybe don't get much attention nowadays, but were very important to these traditional readers. He says, those who indulge in desires rely on the superficial clarity through the senses to chase after sensory pleasures. By obstructing their spiritual faculties, the subtle initiating impulses of heaven float upwards, right? Rather than breathing deeply from the heels. Right, and I'll just read what I highlighted in the interest of time. When desires fill the chest, right, they say that ordinary men and stupid people, right, that in these traditional interpretations, breathe shallowly, and it leads to a superficial clarity, which leads to them being erratic, and emotions like joy and anger rise recklessly, like throwing a drop of water into a boiling pot of oil, causing flames to burst forth wildly. And he says, without superficial clarity, there's no restless qi energy. We follow the breath, right? 随息, so we're getting some sort of positive recommendation here. One can retreat and conceal, allowing true understanding to fill within, making the entire body aligned with heaven. And we get more of the same here. Mental activities rise and fall with qi energy. When the qi energy returns to the heels, the heart-mind does not fluctuate. Most people breathe through their throats. Those who are submissive make a croaking sound as if trying to speak. This throat sound is obstructed and gets stuck in the throat as if trying to escape, right? And this is referring to the people in whom the tianji, these subtle initiating impulses of heaven or nature, are shallow. Another interesting line, which is a throwaway line for most modern interpretations, occurs in the first chapter when it's talking about the spiritual being who lives on some yonder mountain. And there's this line where it says he concentrates its spirit. And the important thing here is that Wang Fuzhi thinks the important thing isn't, again, the traces or the vestiges of these cultural heroes or even Zhuangzi, but it's the spirit of their teaching, and he thinks it boils down to really two things. We need to concentrate our spirit, and we need to deepen our breath so as to be able to accord with the subtle initiating impulses of nature. And from here, we can look at his account of carefree wandering. So there's a background of a lot of traditional Chinese theories about breath and qi circulation. If you remove these aspects of Wang Fuzhi's interpretation, it will look a lot like modern interpretations, where it's about adapting to changing circumstances, not having a fixed mindset, and so on and so forth. But he provides a background of how we get into that state. So it winds up not just being, right, banal advice about being open-minded or something. Anyway, he says, temporarily inhabiting a physical form, right, we come alive, it's a contingent thing, we assume a shape, right? In the expanse between heaven and earth is simply to wander along. And this is one place where we have to change our translation from carefree wandering to fit his unique interpretation. And he says, when one ceases to distinguish between trivial and significant, right, when we're not preoccupied with being important people, we can be content with ourselves, and that's it, and we go no further. We no longer have fixed predetermined goals and really no fixed predetermined endpoint on our kind of four-way through existence, which he sees on analogy of yo, which could be a journey or a kind of wandering along. He takes this wu dai, this relying upon nothing, to be a key notion. And he says it means not relying on external circumstances to establish oneself, not depending on concrete affairs passing a certain way to achieve merit, not requiring concrete facts to be a certain way to build a reputation. Whether trivial or significant, when resting in heaven's equilibrium, one is invariably reposed and remote, which is how I propose translating Xiao Yao here. Reposed is when, through a tendency towards diminution or dissolution, right, on our journey towards death, one moves through life while mentally letting things go. Wang being translated out through a circumlocution instead of just translating it as forgetting or as the horribly misleading oblivion of some scholars. Yao assumes its regular meaning of remote, and it implies being drawn beyond limits, unbound from the realm of cognitive understanding. So the interesting aspect of Wang Fuzhi's reading, beyond the various aspects of qi circulation, is that he thinks zhi means something like cognitive understanding. And he thinks our faculty of cognitive understanding is quite limited. And that if we get beyond it, there are certain kinds of tacit understanding that we can cultivate. And this is how we achieve this more remote or detached state towards the world around us. And again, this becomes to be linked with the breath and things like that in all sorts of strange and interesting ways. And he says when one achieves this state, right, when one's reposed and can kind of just pass through life and not get hung up on things, let things go and let things be, and can be attached and not be caught up on trying to pin everything down with their faculty of understanding, certain things follow. He thinks then we can level accounts of things, right? The purported goal of chapter 2. He thinks the Lord of Life can be nourished, the purported goal of chapter 3 on his understanding. He thinks physical shapes can be forgotten and virtue fulfilled, the purported goal of chapter 5, and it fits at least all of the stories in it except the last one. The mundane world can be entered, yet harm kept at bay, the purported goal of chapter 4. And one can respond to being an emperor or king, and the world well ordered, the purported goal of chapter 7. All of this aligns with the great primeval inspiration and allows one to forget all about life and death, i.e., the purported goal of chapter 6. Nothing is off limits for wandering along. Indeed, everything is wandering along. So you can see Xiao and Yao do all the work here. Yo just means the way things move through existence. So now to take stock, we have two accounts. We have that of a famous Buddhist who thinks the forgetting the ego self and being able to access the true controller is the key to wandering through life. Whereas for Wang Fuzhi, the word wandering actually doesn't do much work. It's just we foray through life, but he thinks there's a certain mode of being we can assume. One with these sorts of reposed aspects, and with this kind of remote tendency. But I'll move along now to our final commentator, Lin Yunming, who's a literary critic, but his commentary has interesting philosophical aspects. So when it comes to the question of the true controller, he thinks that we can recognize the changes of transformations between I and other, this and that, and the attached notions of right and wrong, yet ultimately no one knows what causes it. And I'll just focus on the parts of his reading that seem very, very much to track aspects or recurrent aspects of the contemporary Anglophone Zhuangzi studies. For instance, the notion Chengxin for Hanshan Deqing is a positive notion. It means the true controller, whereas for Lín Yúnmíng, it's a negative attribute, meaning a subjective bias. Right? And the idea is we don't want a Chengxin because it makes us unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Instead, he advocates stopping with one doesn't know, and he cashes this out in terms of a familiar notion from those who follow maybe the readings of A.C. Graham and those whose interpretations are shaped by his. So he says, from words, more words are continuously generated, leading to an endless cycle because they transition from one point to another. If one wishes to avoid the cycle, it is simply a matter of adapting to this, yin shi. And here's a key bit. The chapter 2 does not require me to speak in order to achieve equality. It exists independently of my words. Adapting to this means allowing each thing to be right in its own way without imposing one's own views upon it. This might be relevant for the previous talk in some ways. And he says the phrase adapting to this, yin shi, encapsulates the central idea of chapter 2, right? So this is very much akin to Graham's reading, with the entire chapter unfolding this idea. And here's his overview passage from chapter 2. And we realize that there are certain limits to our understanding, which at least smells a little bit like the skeptical readings that had currency for maybe in the 90s and early 2000s in the Anglophone scholarship. And he says the response to this is yin shi, adapting to this. Curiously, he explains, and these are my last two slides, not so pair, so don't panic, I'll be wrapping up shortly. But one curious thing is on Wang Fuzhi's reading, you'll note that Yo didn't do much work. It was mainly Xiao and Yao. It's the opposite for Lín Yúnmíng. For Lín Yúnmíng, Yo does all the work, and he glosses it in terms of this concept of Tian Yo from chapter 26. And I'll just go to the highlighted bits, and I translated all of his interlinear glosses to give a taste of what that would look like, and I put numbers and so on, but he says conscious beings rely on breath, right? So it's reaffirming some of the stuff we saw in Wang Fuzhi's reading. Their breath's insufficiency is not the fault of heaven. Heaven continuously provides day and night without cessation, but humans block the various pathways. The body has spacious chambers, and the heart-mind has its heavenly wanderings. If a room lacks empty space, and we get this kind of sexist analogy. If a room lacks empty space, then the wife and the mother-in-law will quarrel. If the heart mind is not engaged in heavenly wanderings, the six senses will contend with each other. So it all comes down to adopting this mode of inshi and being unobstructed in various ways. And here are some of the annotations we'll quickly look at, and then I will turn it over to questions. So he glosses shi is unobstructed and says this means that the sage can wander freely because his or her heart mind is unobstructed. So external things cannot obstruct him or her. All creatures with knowledge rely on the circulation of their breath. Their breath's insufficiency is not heaven's fault. Heaven provides continuously, but humans block their pathway, so who's to blame? And lastly, if a room lacks empty space, the wife and mother-in-law will be cramped together and inevitably quarrel. If the heart mind does not engage in heavenly wanderings, the six senses will fight, resulting in endless strife. And we get this kind of weird line at the end. The goodness of great force and hills to people is undeniable. Even the spirits cannot prevail over them. What in the world does that mean? Well, we get an explanation. And since the primal spirit in us cannot prevail over the various disturbances when we don't have a capacious mindset, which is what this tianyo amounts to, it seeks quiet places, right? Like hermits who cannot wander freely in the world and seek seclusion. And as we saw in his preface, the idea is we still engage the world, we just need to cultivate a capacious mindset so as to be able to handle it. It's almost like being a hermit within one's own mind. Many aspects of his reading track familiar aspects of contemporary Anglophone readings, the only difference being that he doesn't shy away from talking about qi circulation or the breath. And here's my big bibliography. Most of it comes from a book project I'm currently working on that's under contract, and I guess I'll submit to them in June of next year. It's on Hanshan Deqing, Wang Fuzhi, and Lin Yunming on Zhuangzi. So that's that. I'll stop the recording in 1 second here. Maybe